Hello, and welcome to the Geocurrents lecture series on the historical geography of natural psychoactive substances. Today's talk is the second part of a lecture on the hallucinogenic substances of the Eastern Hemisphere. I'll begin by talking about non-medical uses of solanaceous drugs to the ages. In the previous lecture on the same topic, I talked about the medical uses, but now I'll move on to spiritual, if you will, or recreational, if you will, although the latter is a bit of a stretch, uses through the ages. There's a lot of debate in the scientific community about whether these substances, like henbane, were used for ritual purposes in ancient times or in prehistorical times. This slide looks at the Neolithic period, the early agricultural period before the development of so-called civilization. But in a lot of Neolithic sites, henbane seeds have been found. The article that I show here, published by Cambridge University Press a few years back, was a bit of a debunking article. So to quote from the abstract, were drugs in use in prehistory? Recent claims for the use of hallucinogenic substances have been made and caused a stir. However, new work in the Scottish Neolithic ceremonial site suggests that archaeologists and the media may have been jumping to the wrong conclusions. In other words, we may find remains of henbane seeds, but we don't know what they were used for. We certainly can't say for certain that they were used ritually. More recently, and this is from actually early 2024, at least the article was, a Roman site showed archaeologists excavating a Roman site found large numbers of henbane seeds in a vial made from an animal bone. And as the article mentions, found in the Netherlands, this bone canister is the first concrete evidence of black henbane seeds use in the Roman period. As Live Science reports, it is also the earliest known example of seeds being stored for later use. Well, certainly seeds were being stored for later use for a long time, and henbane seeds as well. But this is the first tested archaeological use. But again, we don't know what they were used for. We don't know the dose. In small amounts, they wouldn't have done too much. In larger doses, they would have done a lot. They certainly had medical uses. I talked about that in the previous lecture. But were they used as a psychoactive substance for ritual or religious purposes? There are a lot of speculations. One is that henbane was used at ancient oracles, such as the most famous oracle, the Oracle of Delphi, oracle of the god Apollo. And at this oracle, the Pythia, the high priestess of Apollo, would answer questions to supplicants in an enigmatic fashion. The motto of Delphi was "Know thyself," but certainly much written about in the classical world and was extremely important. No doubt about that. But was the Pythia under some sort of psychologically altered state? Well, a good chance that she was. It's often been suggested this was from vaporous gases, ethylene gases in particular. To quote here, Plutarch, very famous ancient author, served as high priest at Delphi for several years and stated that her oracular powers, that of the Pythia, appeared to be associated with vapors from spring waters that flowed under the temple. And it's been suggested that these were actually from a hallucinogenic ethylene gases. Other scholars have suggested other things, including oleander leaves, which are quite poisonous. But poisons can generate psychoactive effects in sublethal doses. Who knows? Henbane has also been proposed as a drug that ancient Greeks used to forget. So it is known that wreaths of henbane leaves crown newly deceased people to make them forget their former lives as they cross the river Styx into the afterlife. That makes it as a possible candidate for nepenthe. I talked about that in the lecture on opium. Nepenthe was a drug Homer mentions mixed into wine to make people forget, maybe henbane. Even the Viking berserkers have been said to have taken henbane. Now, I talked about this before with Amanita muscaria, as it suggested that the berserkers took fly agaric, profoundly psychoactive substance. And so we find this in scholarly sources. and science journalism as well. So here's an article. Crazed Viking warriors may have been high on henbane. Well, henbane is certainly found in Viking archaeological sites. It's been found mixed with beer. We know this from the residue that's been analyzed. And the berserkers themselves went into this kind of battle fury, and some of the descriptions can be somewhat consistent with henbane. To quote, berserkers entered a trance-like state, which was said to have started with chills and tremors before a warrior's face became swollen and red. Then the warrior would become enraged. Now, henbane has a lot of atropine, and as I mentioned in the earlier lecture, one of the symptoms of atropine is if a person has too much, they'll be red as a beet, as well as mad as a hatter and high as a kite. Well, that's not part of the statement, but they go together. So perhaps, but that certainly would be disadvantages if a Viking warrior, a berserker, had too much henbane. It's atropine and these other drugs, scopolamine, hyoscyamine. They can lead to weak and rapid heartbeat, elevated temperatures, reduced sweating, confusion, fainting, trouble breathing, coordination problems. Yeah, being enraged, that fits, and that would work for the berserker, but these other effects wouldn't be necessary. Well, wouldn't be advantageous in battle. In medieval Europe, henbane continued to be used both as a medicine, as I discussed, although people like Hildegard of Bingen were very careful to use it in very small doses and only for very specific things. But scholars of the time also associate it with witchcraft and demon. It's very clear in Albert the Great, or Saint Albertus Magnus's work. Albert the Great was a monk, a scholar. He was the teacher of Saint Thomas Aquinas, a very important role in medieval Christendom. And he was one of the few scholars of the time who really delved into natural history, the natural world. Most of them were concerned with logic, dialectics, philosophy more broadly. But only a few medieval scholars really were interested in the world of nature, and Albertus Magnus was. And in his classic work, he reported that necromancers use henbane to invoke the souls of the dead as well as demons. And going right along with this, there was the common view that witches, and up until around 1700, there was a widespread belief in European society that many women and some men were guilty of witchcraft and consorted with demons and with Satans to do all sorts of nefarious activities. But up until the Enlightenment, it was widely believed that witches used a hallucinogenic flying ointment. We see a woodcut here from the 16th century, witches preparing a magic salve, and these were often most effectively applied as salves. Note the naked witch, top left, riding through the air, mounted on a goat. And to quote the Wikipedia article on flying ointment, the ointment is known by a variety of names, including witch's flying ointment, green ointment, magic salve, lycanthropic ointment. The poisonous ingredients listed in works on ethnobotany include belladonna. That's one of the plants in this category of psychoactive substances. Henbane, another. Datura, another. Mandrake, another. Hemlock, a poison, and or wolfsbane. It's very interesting to look at things like wolfsbane. That's a very profound poison. Aconite, it's also called. Comes from a plant called the monk's hood. It has different names. But a mere 2 milligrams of aconite, or 1 gram of the plant itself, can cause death from respiratory paralysis or heart failure. But interestingly, I think this is in a later slide, combining one of these solanaceous plants that has atropine, scopolamine, and the like, can actually counteract the poisonous or deadly effects. The two are antagonistic to each other, we might say. There were big debates in medieval, especially Renaissance period, about whether witches could actually fly. And this is a very interesting passage from a play from the early 1600s, translated to English, whereas one person asked of the others, others believe that witches can fly. And can't they? Well, certainly not, you ignorant fellow. Since I'm no specialist in these matters, I must ask what happens. They rub themselves with an ointment. And then what? Now, here's the key. The ointment, which is an opiate, now we wouldn't use the term opiate today, a drug, we would say. The ointment, which is a drug made of henbane, given to them by the devil, sends them to sleep. They dream such a dream that they think they are not dreaming at all. And since the devil has great power to deceive, he makes them all dream the same dream. Now, there's a lot of pre-modern sentiments in that statement, but there's some pretty accurate ones about a dream that they think they are not dreaming at all. I mean, that's not a terrible description of the effects of henbane. It has psychological effects when a person is waking, often very disturbing, very serious, but then there often follows a period of sleep where in intense dreams, let's put it this way, occur. And anyway, as I mentioned before, flying ointment is used as a salve, and it's best absorbed in the armpits and genitals. And this is where the idea of witches riding on broomsticks comes from. And there are many, many depictions from the period. But the probably what led to this belief was people who were using these sort of substances, women using these substances, would put the salve on a broomstick and then apply it to their genital regions, which is a good place for absorption of the substance. Now, I have to say there are a lot of doubts in the scholarly community about the very existence of flying ointment. I mentioned in the previous lecture Andrew Sherratt's video series from the 1990s. It was on BBC called Sacred Weeds. Episode 3 is on henbane. And as in these others, what Sherratt did was have a couple of volunteers take the substance, and then he had a doctor examine them, and a couple of scholars who had different views on the substance analyze and then debate afterwards. Absolutely fascinating show. But Diane Purkis was on the show, and she's very skeptical well, not of the experience, but rather of its connections with witchcraft. She believes, or believed at the time, I don't know what she thinks now, that this whole notion of the witch using a broomstick and taking flying ointment or various witches' brews had basically been concocted by church officials to discredit female autonomy, and particularly women herbalists or sort of lay medical practitioners, if you will. So it's I found all these episodes fascinating, but the debate on witchcraft was quite interesting. Now, there are a lot of other books on the subject. I have just a couple here that I consulted. One was How Do Witches Fly? And one quote from it is, one might have imagined that using both aconite, okay, that's from monkshood, this intense poison, and belladonna together would have produced a doubly toxic effect. Yes, that's what one would imagine. But not so. The two alkaloids have antagonistic toxic effects on each other, sort of cancel each other out. And then the witch's ointment, Thomas Hatsis details a range of ideas from folk drugs to ecclesiastical fears over medicinal women, how they merge to form the classic witch stereotype. And he actually has formulas and recipes gathered from rare manuscripts in the book. You can also go to these trip reports, many of which have been presented on YouTube. Somebody reading the trip report from the Arrowwood site, and then illustrating it in various ways. But a particularly interesting one I found, and this was early in this year, January 11th, 2024. This is what happens when you mix datura, belladonna, cannabis, monkshood, opium, and mandrake together. So we have in here three of the classic deliriant solanaceous plants of the Eastern Hemisphere, datura, belladonna, and mandrake. And then we have cannabis, the poison monkshood, and opium thrown in together. And you can see the description. A woman brews up a flying ointment and gets more than she bargained for during an experience in the Scottish mountains. the woman in question spent a lot of time researching and preparing, and had a pretty intense experience. Not entirely pleasant, not entirely horrible either. Quite an interesting one. And I'll actually return to this slide later on because I have another important point to make about it. But before that, I do want to mention that, guess what? Flying ointment has been commercialized. You can buy it over the internet. You can find these salves, buy them and apply them. Interestingly, it says apply at the base of the neck or on your third eye and your forehead. In other words, on the soles of your feet. It's not recommending the genitals or armpits, which are generally a more effective place for absorption of the active ingredient. Okay, I'm going to move on now to Datura, Jimson weed, at least one species is called Jimson weed in the United States. In the next lecture, I'll talk about the use of Datura in what is now the United States by indigenous peoples. But one species, Datura metal, found in the Eastern Hemisphere and was consumed particularly in South Asia, although it's hard to say when and to what extent. But it's got the same group of chemicals as henbane, mandrake, and belladonna. It may have been used also by Taoist mystics in China. There's controversy about that. So it's found mostly in India, and the term Datura actually comes from a Sanskrit term. Datura has a very broad range, almost staggeringly broad. It's thought that it originated in Mexico and somehow spread across the seas, but you can find Datura in many, many places. But like cannabis, Datura is sacred to the Hindu god Shiva. So here we have a slide on why we offer Datura to Lord Shiva. So in rituals devoted to Shiva, there'll be an array of plant materials put out, including cannabis and Datura, which are sacred to him. When I was preparing this lecture in the spring, I went through to learn about all of the sacred plants of Shiva. Some are these two, cannabis and Datura, are the most obvious mind alterants. Others, perhaps. Some others are poisonous. Anyway, it's an interesting group of plants. As the illustration on the right shows a depiction of Shiva, and it's interesting to read the caption here. The deity Shiva drinks the cosmic poison churned from the ocean of milk. This is getting very deep into Hindu ideas about the origin of the world. But anyway, note the swollen blue spot in the throat of the god caused by the transmutation of the Datura engendering poison hala hala. So there's an entire set of beliefs, myths, if you will, about Shiva potentially being poisoned and then transferring this poison into a harmless substance. I'm not going to get into the complexities of this to any greater degree, but I am certainly very curious myself as to whether Datura is actually consumed by contemporary followers of Shiva in India, of whom there are hundreds of millions. Shiva and Vishnu are the main deities of Hinduism, usually viewed as attributes of a larger ultimate deity, if you will. But Shiva worship, yes, is very common, and you do have these offerings of Datura. I went on a lot of Hindu sites and did searches to try to find out, well, are people actually taking it and eating it? And I really didn't find much evidence, or hardly any. And I would say, again, and I've said this in a previous lecture about a different substance, but if Datura is used ritually in South Asian Hindu society, it would be in what is known as left-handed tantric practices. So tantrism is a particular orientation within Hinduism and Buddhism, esoteric, highly mystical. Most who follow the tantric path follow the right-handed path, which relies on a high degree of purity in conduct and action. It's the minority left-handed path that's associated with the unorthodox path, which involves the consumption of meat, various sexual practices. Some of you may have heard of tantric sex, and intoxication and other things. So if you're going to find it, this is where you would, but it's not in the mainstream at all. I did find an article on Tibetan Tantric Buddhism and psychoactive plants, and an observation that many of the scriptures discuss ointments and drugs, especially those applied to the eyes and feet. The use of various species of datura is particularly evident, sometimes called crazy datura or Shiva's datura, generally employed as a narcotic paste or a wood in a fire ceremony that could be easily absorbed through the skin or lungs. Now, this is in texts. I mean, is this still being done today? I didn't find evidence. Although datura is used medically in Ayurvedic practices, this would be in very small quantities. Note the article here, International Journal of Ayurvedic and Herbal Medicine, a precious toxic plant, but it lists 50 diseases and datura in 521 formulations. It has also been suggested that the original thugs used datura. So the term thug comes from thugi, which was a group of criminals in India. We know them best from the 19th century British reports, many of which are not particularly accurate. They may have dated back to the 1300s. But these were criminals who would waylay, rob, and sometimes murder travelers, especially wealthy travelers. And it has been widely reported that they would stupefy their victims with datura seeds and somehow get them to drink a concoction or something and then rob them and often kill them. Wikipedia article on this, I think, is it's pretty good. Just a quote from it: so the thugs were gangs of professional robbers and murderers who wandered the roads of central India and would sometimes use preparations of datura metal to stupefy the rich merchants before strangling or stabbing them. According to accounts of the thugs written by early 19th century colonial authors, tended to evoke an Orientalist fantasy of bloodthirsty Hindu cult offering human sacrifices to the goddess Kali. A lot of this was way overblown, and modern scholars tend to perceive the reality of the thugi as more just a matter of mere criminal activity undertaken for gain by organized groups of unemployed soldiers of both Hindu and Muslim faith. That's probably more accurate. Datura did come to Europe, never widely used, but it has been associated with the Romani people, also known as gypsies, although that is considered a pejorative term and is best not used. Gypsy comes from the word Egypt because Europeans thought that these people who came into Europe in the 14th century were from Egypt. Well, it's known from a variety of sources that they were originally from India. Their name can be traced to a Sanskrit word referring to a particular caste of traveling musicians and dancers. And it's noted that the Roma people moved westward into the Ghaznavid Empire and later through the Byzantine Empire and arrived in Europe around the 13th or 14th century. The first accounts are from the early 1300s, at least to my knowledge. So I just have to say a word about the Ghaznavid Empire. You can see on the map that around the year 1000 to 1100, it was a very large state in the Middle East, centered in what is now Afghanistan. It was formed by Turkish generals who were recruited into the armies of Persians, of Persian-speaking states in the region, and eventually often as slaves. But originally, the Turkic-speaking armed forces generals took over power and made their own empire. The Ghaznavids are particularly important for beginning to go into northern India, first to loot and raid temples, and later to start establishing control. And that's really was the origin of the push of Islam into India. There had been Islam had been in Sindh in what is now southern Pakistan much earlier, but this is Islam first made its first incursion into northern India and then spread south. And these events were important in a variety of ways. One was that so much gold and precious metals were looted out of Hindu temples that it resulted supposedly in a big increase in precious metal supply throughout the Eastern Hemisphere and even, or at least throughout Eurasia. and even a certain surge of inflation, or at least it has been alleged. It was a major event in world history. So it's likely that the ancestors of the Romani people were, well, as the previous article said, musicians and I can't remember what else they were described as, but they were probably a group, a sort of a caste group that were noted as camp followers. Now, camp followers were very important throughout the medieval and into the early modern period. These were people who would follow military campaigns and provide services to them. Services like tending to horses, metalwork, fixing weapons, fixing pots used for cooking food, fortune telling, something soldiers are often very keen to find out about, sexual services, prostitution, if you will. And all of these activities have music, entertainment. All of these activities have been associated with the Romani people, who many of whom still live a migratory lifestyle in modern, caravans, as they would be called in the United Kingdom, pulled by horses. Now often pulled by motor vehicles, but this sort of movement lifestyle persists in many places. And just one other slide on the Romani. As you can tell, if you've listened to any of these lectures, I'm very interested in historical linguistics and what it can tell us about historical geography. And with the Romani, you can actually look at their language and you can trace out their migration path. The language itself is very clearly an Indic language. Its closest relative is probably Punjabi, spoken in parts of India and much of Pakistan. And we have that's the base vocabulary, but picked up Persian terms, picked up Kurdish terms, Armenian terms, Georgian, Greek, Slavic terms. So sort of as they moved, following armies, most likely anyway, selling their services to armed forces, they had to be very multilingual, and they picked up words from places they passed through. One other issue on Datura, it's important in parts of Africa as well. Now, I haven't talked much about Africa in this class, probably not enough, but there's a pretty well-known, anthropologically well-known Datura cult among the Tsonga people who live near the border of Mozambique and South Africa and Southern Africa. And they use a species of Datura in girls' initiation, which is very interesting. I'll talk about Datura in North America. It was usually used in male initiation, although sometimes girls and women used it too. It depended on the society. But this is just for girls' initiation. And to quote here, the paper is a description of the sociocultural analysis of Datura fastuosa ingestion in the girls' puberty schools of the Tsonga people of Mozambique. The rite involves music color synesthesia. That's, in other words, where your senses sort of overlap. Color and music become one and the same. And the hearing of supernatural voices, and is associated by the Tsonga with fertility. And finally, the last thing I'll say about Datura is, despite its dangers, and it's, I think as I noted before, there are tremendous number of just horrific examples of people, particularly young, adolescent boys, teenagers in the United States taking Datura and having horrific experiences, often associated with mutilation, death, and so on. I'll talk in the next lecture about how some groups in the indigenous groups in the United States were kind of able to domesticate Datura in a way through very, very carefully constructed rituals. That comes later. But I will note here that here's a Live Your Magic website, and the author is propounding the magic and mystery of Datura, and it's a guide to the metaphysical properties, which it has, but I just say beware if you want to go that way. The next topic I want to take up in today's lecture is ergot, a Claviceps purpurea. It's purpurea, excuse me. This is a fungal parasite, especially of rye, but you can also find it on wheat and other grains. It is a poison. It can causes acute and chronic diseases, but it also contains lysergic acid amide, which is a precursor to LSD, and has some similar effects. If one is eating ergot-infested grain for a long period of time, the consequences are dire. Physical consequences, most serious, is known as St. Anthony's fire. So ergot restricts the flow of blood in the blood vessels, so you get gangrene in the extremities and a number of other very serious symptoms. You could look at the symptoms here. Well, there's convulsive and there's gangrenous. And convulsive, you get spasms, mania, psychosis, headaches, nausea. And gangrenous, you can lose parts of your body. Well, you can die from it. And it was not uncommon in medieval Europe. Grain often became infected if it rains too much in the summer. You can easily get ergot growing in your rye crop. Rye mostly grown in northeastern Europe, but grown in other areas as well. And ergot could be found in wheat as well. A very interesting book on this subject. It's out of date, written in 1991. I read it when it first came out and was absolutely fascinated by it. But Mary Matosian's Poisons of the Past, Mold Epidemics in History. And she argues that we should pay much more attention to contaminated food supply in the past, because it was linked with lots of diseases, decreased fertility, morbidity, all sorts of things, as well as causing a lot of unwanted psychoactive effects. So just a quote from, I believe this is the back of the book, but did food poisoning cause the Salem witch hunts? Well, Mary Matosian argues this. She says that in the Salem witch hunts, people were eating ergot-infested grain, and they were having hallucinations, and that's what led to the witch craze. But she also mentions other significant events. Matosian argues that epidemics, sporadic outbursts of bizarre behavior, and low fertility and high death rates from the 14th to the 18th centuries may have been caused by food poisoning from microfungi. Low fertility in pockets. Generally, it was a high mortality rate and a pretty high fertility rate to make up for that high mortality rate. Ergot-derived drugs do have medical uses. So, as I said, it constricts the blood vessels, and that can cause gangrene over the long period of time, but it can also be used to reduce bleeding. It was most widely used for postpartum bleeding since the medieval period. I'm sure this was something that Hildegard knew about. Well, I'm not sure. I haven't looked into it, but I would imagine because it was very common for women to bleed after birth, and many died from it, and this could be a useful medicine. It was also an abortive fashion in the medieval period, used to induce abortion. Anyway, ergot produces lysergic acid amide, as I mentioned, and that is used to make LSD. So there are very good reports up into the 1950s of just these bizarre outbreaks of people having hallucinations. This article from Vice that mentions hallucinating visions of hell. Some of them probably had visions of hell. I hope all of them didn't. But anyway, pretty clearly linked to eating ergot-infested grain. But ergot may have been used intentionally in a controlled manner in the ancient world, particularly in the Eleusinian mysteries. So I have to talk a little bit about Eleusis in the ancient Mediterranean. As the Wikipedia notes, the Eleusinian initiations were held every year for the cult of Demeter and Persephone. So Demeter, a goddess of grain, Persephone, her daughter, Persephone abducted by Hades, taken down to hell, and eventually it's worked out where Persephone can come back to Earth for 6 months, and that in the mythic imagination that is associated with this alternation between summer and winter. But anyway, every year in Eleusis, very close to Athens, they have these large-scale secret religious rites. Was very complicated. An individual had to undergo purification and fasting for quite a period of time. So they're very carefully shepherded. There were dramatic reenactments of the events in the myth. They were taken underground. and eventually they would receive the kukion, which is a drink, a kind of a beer-like drink. Most Western scholars have just viewed this as a mild drink, but there is a view, and it's getting increasing attention, that the kukion contained a psychoactive substance, probably ergot. And anyway, it's hard to it's all too easy to underemphasize the importance of the Eleusinian mysteries. I mean, they were big. It was the most important Greek ritual system, or at least secret ritual initiation. Notable participants here, I mean, we have the playwright Aeschylus, we have the philosopher Plato, then we have a whole slew of Roman emperors, from Augustus through Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, all the way to Julian. Julian is after Constantine, after the Roman Empire began to Christianize. Julian was known as the apostate because he was raised a Christian but rejected Christianity and tried to bring back the old religion. He was only an emperor for a few years. He died fighting the Persians, and his repaganization campaign came to naught. And part of this repaganization platform of Julian is he went to Eleusis and was initiated into the mystery, and perhaps had a psychedelic experience. It's hard to say what was involved because just like Fight Club, the first rule of the Eleusinian mysteries was that one did not talk about them. These were secret. The belief was that if you talked about what happened, horrific things would happen to you. Rather amazing, though, that we didn't get descriptions regardless of that. But there are, there's a lot of descriptions of the sort of environment and sort of basic circumstances, but actually what happened within the sanctuary, and we know about drinking the kukion, but we don't really know a whole lot more. Well, to quote this article, ancient writers, including Sophocles, Herodotus, Aristophanes, and Plutarch, mention the mysteries. They were all initiates. Yet they became an intriguing secret of ancient Greece because the initiates, with remarkable consistency, swore not to disclose what happened in the inner sanctum. At any rate, there is now actual archaeological evidence that the Eleusinian mysteries, the kukion consumed at the Eleusinian mysteries, contained ergot. So here is an article from 2021. Actually, the actual archaeological exploration was quite a bit earlier, but it was kind of hidden. The original report was written in Catalan, and it took a while for archaeologists outside of Catalonia to read about this. But anyway, archaeological evidence unearthed fragments of ergot in an ancient Greek ceremonial cup found in Girona, Spain. That's in Catalonia, dating back to 300 BCE. Remnants of ergot were also found in the dental calculus of a 25-year-old male, providing evidence that an ergot-infused drink was consumed. In this site, Mas Castellar is a significant temple dedicated to the goddess Demeter and her daughter Persephone, the chief goddesses associated with the Eleusinian mysteries, as well as with the kukion, the mysterious potion consumed at the famous ritual at Eleusis. So in other words, this ritual was not just being carried out at Eleusis, but in a number of sort of secondary ritual sites connected with it. And as far as I know, that at least I haven't read much about that, and I've done quite a bit of reading about ancient Greece. And it's important to note, and I had a very similar map in an earlier lecture, that the ancient Greeks did not just live in what is today Greece. They lived all around the northern Mediterranean. There were Greek cities in Spain and France and Italy, and including what is now Georgia. Very, very extensive. These kind of maps exaggerate the inland spread. But this site in Catalonia is very close to a Greek city called Emporion, which is definitely related to the word emporium, as the Romans called it, because it was such an important commercial hub. And anyway, in 1978, the ergot thesis was first propounded in a book called The Road to Eleusis, unveiling the secrets of the mysteries. And to read from the back cover, a groundbreaking trio, a mycologist, a student of fungus in other words, a chemist, and a historian, proposed a radical theory that the sacred potion imbibed during these rites was infused with a potent psychoactive entheogen, or in other words, psychedelic drug. This is not just a challenge to conventional interpretations, it was a revolutionary reframe of the role of naturally occurring psychedelic drugs they have played in spiritual rituals and rites since time immemorial. So I want to talk a little bit about the three authors. So one I've introduced to you in an earlier lecture. That's Robert Gordon Wasson, who was a banker, actually vice president for public relations at J.P. Morgan and Company, but is best known as a mycologist or an ethnomycologist, someone who studies the use of fungi in different cultures. He married a Russian woman, was fascinated with her fascination with edible wild mushrooms, and interested in the marked cultural difference towards fungi in Russia and the United States. They started studying mushrooms in Russia, in world history, and beyond. This took them all the way to southern Mexico, where they were the first to document and participate in a psilocybin ritual among the Mazatec Indians of Oaxaca. I'll talk about this in the next lecture. There's some problems associated with it. But Wasson was definitely a pioneer, and no doubt about that, and an extremely knowledgeable mycologist and ethnomycologist. The second author is equally impressive, Albert Hofmann, Swiss chemist known for being the first to synthesize, ingest, and learn of the psychedelic effects of LSD. Hofmann's team also isolated, named, and synthesized the principal psychedelic mushroom compounds, psilocybin and psilocin, authored more than 100 scientific arguments, and wrote a book called, translated from German here, LSD, My Problem Child. And I have the illustration of Hofmann, who lived to be 102, by the way, only died in 2008. But an illustration of him on a bicycle, and that is to commemorate, if you will, what some people call Bicycle Day, because he first tested LSD on himself in 1943, in the middle of World War II, and felt the effects while riding home on a bicycle. The third author was a classicist, Carl Ruck, professor of classics at Boston University, PhD from Harvard, so very well trained, very widely published, published on the use of drugs in the ancient world, on religion, but also even on works on teaching Greek and Latin, on Greek poets and the like. He looks very unhappy there, and everything I've read about him was he's a rather melancholy person, but one of the reasons for that probably is he was basically drummed out of the profession of classicist. I mean, he had tenures where he couldn't lose his job, but his peers, most of them were just horrified by this book, suggesting that something closely related to LSD could have been responsible for this incredibly important religious rite, central significance in ancient Greece. This was just considered outrageous, and so he sort of became persona non grata. Interestingly, now his ideas are being recovered and taken much further. So in 2020, Brian Murarescu, not a scholar, although he has graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Brown with a degree in Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, so very well educated, became a lawyer, like many lawyers, was a bit bored with the profession, and started to take up where Carl Ruck left off in his book, The Immortality Key. He argues not only was Eleusis, the mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries, all about taking ergot and having psychedelic experiences, but he argued that this extended into the early Christian Eucharist. So if it was shocking to say in the 70s that an ancient Greek pagan ritual used LSD to say early or something similar to LSD, but to say the early Christian Eucharist was a psychoactive substance, well, that's obviously going to rub a lot of people the wrong way. But it's interesting, he doesn't seem to be getting the kind of blowback that Ruck did. Times have changed and attitudes have softened. He doesn't have any direct evidence at all that the early Christian Eucharist was psychedelic, but he does have some indirect evidence that's pretty interesting. He has many citations of people writing that if you take the Eucharist, you will see God. I guarantee it. Now, I don't think anyone would say that about the bread and wine of a Catholic Mass today. People may have a profound experience taking the Eucharist, but I don't think many people are going to say, I guarantee you will see God. Anyway, there are big questions about how extensively was ergot used in the ancient world or beyond. You can see Albert Hofmann has a whole book on ergot alkaloids, history, chemistry, and therapeutic uses. There have been a lot of interesting finds. One was the so-called Toland man, somebody who presumably was a human sacrifice. You can see a rope around his neck, thrown into a bog in Denmark. And in these low oxygen, acidic environments, you get tremendous preservation, essentially the creation of a mummy, even mummifying his stomach contents. And they know what his last meal was. It was a porridge of vegetables and seeds, wild and cultivated, including a lot of barley. And guess what? The barley contained a large amount of ergot. Maybe it was just contaminated barley, which people often ate because they didn't have better barley. Maybe it was done to put him in an altered state of consciousness before he was killed and thrown into the bog. Anyway, this thesis has been taken in other directions. 2005, a book came out, John Grigsby, called The Truth Behind England's Oldest Legend, Beowulf and Grendel. So this is, Beowulf is this famous old English poem about early Anglo-Saxon warriors in their mead hall, and this monster Grendel coming in and killing the warriors, and Beowulf fighting against them. But anyway, to quote from the publicity for the book, Grigsby argues that the Toland man, we just saw in the previous slide, may have been killed in the rites of the goddess Nerthus, mentioned by Tacitus in his Germania. So Tacitus, famous Roman historian, who wrote a whole book on the German peoples, extremely important in the history of Latin literature anyway. But Grigsby suggests that the ingestion of ergot was part of the Nerthus cult, and that the subjugation of this religion by Odin-worshipping Danes in the 5th and 6th century lay behind the epic tale of Beowulf. Well, interesting thesis. Not much evidence. I don't know any evidence. All very circumstantial. So not something that scholars have taken very seriously. So anyway, some of the arguments against the ergot hypothesis of the Eleusinian mysteries. One is that, well, there's all sorts of religious rituals in the world, and they result in people having very profound experiences. You can go into a Pentecostal church in the United States, and you can see people at Pentecost, or they may do it at other times, experiencing, at least in their own view, the Holy Spirit descending on them, and they may be writhing on the floor and speaking in tongues, believing that their utterances, which sound nonsensical, are actually given in the original language of humankind. I mean, that's pretty common in many parts of the U.S. They're not taking any sorts of drugs. So religious enthusiasm can do it in itself. And enthusiasm, the word originally meant filled with God. Theos, enthusiasm. Fasting and other ritual activities could have helped generate trance states, and we know the initiates in Eleusis did a lot of fasting and underwent other trying activities. Or there could have been a different psychoactive agent. Amanita muscari has been suggested. Opium, Syrian rue, which has harmala alkaloids, which are psychoactive, maybe even with a DMT containing plant. I'll talk about DMT in subsequent lectures. Or maybe psilocybin mushrooms, psilocybe mushrooms that have psilocybin. I'm nearing the end of this lecture, but I want to move into some, one important question, as I promised earlier from this slide on what happens when you mix datura, belladonna, cannabis, monkshood, opium, and mandrake together. And I spent a little time reading some of the comments, and the most insightful one was from Jimothy 2638, who said simply, "Why, oh why did the Europeans resort to a mixture of poisons when they had access to psilocybin?" So in the earlier slide, I suggest that maybe the psilocybe mushrooms containing psilocybin and psilocin, profoundly powerful psychoactive substances, may have been used. Psilocybin does grow in Europe, so why weren't they using it? Or were they using it? Was psilocybin being used in Europe? Psilocybin is compared to these solanaceous plants, belladonna, mandrake, datura, and the like, is non-toxic. It's difficult to overdose on. It doesn't have significantly harmful effects on the body. It doesn't mean people who eat it won't necessarily have a bad trip. That certainly does happen. But it is of all the natural psychedelic substances, it is the least toxic. But whereas these European ones are very toxic, datura, belladonna, monkshood, not a different kind of chemical, but definitely a poison. Mandrake, another one of these. Well, did Europeans they had psilocybin mushrooms around? Did they eat them? There's some evidence, but it is weak. So New Scientist had an article back in 2011, earliest evidence for magic mushroom use in Europe. And you can see the evidence right there. This is from a mural in a cave. So this is really old, dominated by a bull. You can see the bull. And then there are 13 small mushroom-like objects that have intrigued scientists. And they believe, the authors of an article believe that this is Psilocybe hispanica, local species with hallucinogenic properties. Boy, I am skeptical. I mean, there are so many things those little reddish objects could be, and to just jump to the conclusion that it's psilocybin mushrooms, yeah, not likely, in my humble opinion. But it is true that the genus Psilocybe and Amanita muscaria, they grow in both hemispheres. And what's fascinating is that it's the eastern hemisphere where Amanita muscaria, which I talked about in the previous lecture, is widely consumed, especially in earlier periods. In the western hemisphere, the mushroom was used for psychoactive properties was psilocybe, or psilocybin as it's usually called. Psilocybin is actually one of its chemicals, but most people simply call it psilocybin. So you see very, very widespread. Not all of more than 100, not all of the species are psychoactive, but many of them are. Anyway, just a few concluding remarks then. And I'll elaborate this when I give the 2 lectures on the psychoactive substances of the Western Hemisphere of the Americas. But so the mystery is, there's a geohistorical mystery. Why such a profound difference between the Eastern and Western Hemispheres regarding hallucinogenic substances? So in the Eastern Hemisphere, there has been relatively little hallucinogenic use, at least over the past 1,500 years. When Christianity triumphed in the Roman Empire, the sanctuary of Eleusis was shut down. The mysteries came to an end. So if they had been using ergot in the Kukion, in these rituals associated with Demeter and Persephone, that came to an end. It doesn't seem to have continued in an underground way at all. Many people do argue that the so-called witches' use of mandrake, belladonna, etc., was something that survived Christianity, but survived in out-of-the-way rural places where old beliefs and practices continued, and the church continued to try to stomp them out, and eventually were successful in the anti-witchcraft programs of the, especially early modern period, more in the 16th century and even to the 17th century than in the medieval period. But there certainly was, from the High Middle Ages onward, a lot of persecution of witches, or so-called witches, and a number of scholars have think this was sort of Christianity trying to stomp out the remnants of this drug-using, psychoactive, religious or ritual practices, if you will. So anyway, that's one interpretation. Whereas in the Western Hemisphere, up till 1500, hallucinogenic substances were very commonly used. Many different substances. I'll talk about that in the next few lectures. So there are various ways of talking about this. One would be the spread of what might be called ethical or universalizing religions, because the opposition to psychedelic substances is not just in Christianity, it's in Islam, it's in Judaism, it's in Buddhism, particularly Theravada Buddhism, and eventually came into play in Hinduism, although for certain holy people or practitioners of certain forms, it has a place. So it has, but in mainstream Hinduism, certainly something that is not allowed, or at least very much frowned upon. And certainly once Christianity came to the Americas with the Spaniards, the Spaniards did everything they could to get rid of the use of hallucinogenic plants, which they associated with Satanism and demons and the like. I'll talk about that a little bit in a subsequent lecture. We can also conceive of this not simply through religious practice, but it's more generally in a transition to modernity, which is a gradual movement away from these sorts of ritual practices associated with shamanism. It's interesting to look at it in East Asia, where shamanism has persisted. In Korea, you can still find shamanism, generally practiced by women in remote areas associated with mountains and sort of nature spirits. Whether or not these Korean shamans have used psychedelic substances, or I should say psychoactive substances, I spent some time trying to find information on it. I couldn't find any. They probably did at one time. It probably disappeared. But shamanism didn't disappear entirely in East Asia, or at least it lingered for a long time. But it really came under suspicion by especially Confucianists and Buddhists. The Confucians were the dominant. Confucianism was the dominant philosophy of elite society in China, Korea, Vietnam. Anyway, it just had a real suspicion and contempt of any of these shamanistic practices. But even regardless of that, though, you just don't get the evidence of sort of the plethora of psychoactive substances that you have in the New World. Just didn't have it in the Eastern Hemisphere. Africa would be a good case. I probably should talk more about iboga, which is a powerful hallucinogenic substance, but it's not widespread, mostly in Gabon and a few other areas. And perhaps I just haven't looked in the right place, but I haven't found much evidence for ritual religious practices in most of Africa associated with hallucinogenic drugs. Nor have I really found them looking into New Guinea or tribal peoples elsewhere. But you go to Amazonia, you go to Mesoamerica, you go to many places in the Americas, and you find they're very important, and there's a variety of different substances. So we'll look at that later on. What I mentioned here at the bottom of the slide, though, is this, you may think of this as sort of a gradual transition into modernity away from pre-modern shamanistic practices, which may have been delayed in the Western Hemisphere. And I mentioned that Jared Diamond thesis. So one of the points that Jared Diamond makes in his well-known, highly celebrated and highly disparaged book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, He makes the point in the Eastern Hemisphere, it's a much larger area. You had many more societies connected to each other, overall, a much larger population. Easier flow east to west, both for crops but also simply for trade and commercialization. In the Western Hemisphere, you had a real sort of civilizational cluster in Mesoamerica, southern North America, and another one in the Andes, but they had little, if any, contact, no direct contact, only indirect contact. Whereas there had been contact with the Roman Empire and the Han Empire of China. So much more interconnection over a much larger area with more people meant that sort of modernity in the larger sense of the term was able to develop earlier and at a more profound level in the Eastern Hemisphere, meaning the Western Hemisphere was maybe a few thousand years behind in terms of social development. Like I say, that's a controversial thesis. I take it with a grain of salt. Or some people would say, too, there's just better drugs in the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere, people were using psilocybin, which is much less toxic than the drugs I've been talking about in this lecture and the previous one. Although that begs a question, psilocybin grows in the Eastern Hemisphere. Why didn't people use it? It's often thought that very early human inhabitants of any landscape would sample much of the vegetation, maybe eat in small amounts to find out if it's toxic. And they had a lot of familiarity. Certainly tribal peoples over much of the world have a tremendous amount of ethnobotanical knowledge. Why would they have not gained knowledge of psilocybin? Or if they did, why did they reject it? Well, these are all questions that I can't answer, but I think they are interesting and are worth thinking about. So the next slide the next lecture we'll move on to the psychoactive the hallucinogenic substances of the Western Hemisphere. That will also be in two parts. First part, we'll look first at datura in what is now the United States, particularly what is now California. And then it will move on to the Mesoamerican hallucinogenic complex, where there are some 8 different plants and fungi that were used. Some of them disappeared entirely after the Spanish conquest. Others retreated to the margins and were later rediscovered. So I'll talk about peyote and mescaline, psilocybin. I'll talk about morning glory seeds. And then in the second second lecture, I'll talk about Salvia divinorum, the seer sage, and then focus more on ayahuasca and its main active ingredient, DMT. So I hope you can tune into those. Those will be the last 2 substantive lectures in this series, and then I'll have a concluding lecture to try to wrap up and maybe touch on some of the substances that I haven't had time to delve into. Thank you.